In an earlier video, I introduced Heuristic Inquiry as a qualitative method that I was using with a group of faculty to study chronic absenteeism at my school. In the video, I described the different steps of the process and some of the rationale behind that. And then I promised to go into detail about the epistemology of the method, which was a step I never followed up on, and I was called out by some viewers. These callouts encouraged me to take another look at the video that I had posted, which I was pretty happy with. I could tell I was really excited about the study on chronic absenteeism and to involve some of my colleagues in that process. Now, the actual collaboration didn't end up going the way that I wanted to, which is why I never circled back to the second video or even a series of videos on the topic. But I'm happy that I went back to that first video because it made me really want to do heuristic inquiry on the topic of chronic absenteeism, but a little bit differently, and I'll explain why in a little bit. The purpose of this video is going to be to examine the epistemology implicit in Clark Moustakas' heuristic method or heuristic inquiry. But before I talk about that, I want to explain why it didn't work with the chronic absenteeism study. Oops. I had 5, I think, other colleagues participating in this, and as you could tell from the first video, heuristic inquiry asks the researcher to be deeply involved in the data analysis process where they immerse themselves in it to try to live the solution. They're like searching for the coherent figure, the semblance of the experience that takes its that makes its connection in the actual person. So the researcher has to be involved in that process, and I just didn't have that level of engagement from my collaborators, and I don't want to criticize them because it's not their fault. To be honest, I didn't adequately prepare them for that. I'm talking about faculty who are teaching between like 5 and 7 classes a semester. They're really busy. They know that research is important. There's topics of interest to them, but it was a big ask to try to get them to kind of devote a lot of their free time to exploring the meaning or the significance, the lived meaning of chronic absenteeism. And so what I got from them instead was maybe an hour of time where they would kind of focus on it and then do what they could and then send it off to me and then ask like, all right, am I done? Or is there, what else do I need to do? It wasn't the immersive part of the process. I could do that myself, and then there was no way to integrate their participation with my, the insights that my heuristic inquiry had led to or had generated. If I were to do this again, I would have to have collaborators who were just as interested in and as engaged as me in a studied topic and would be willing to see it through no matter how long it took. And I think it could be beneficial, but let's say there are 3 people involved. Each of us would explore it on our own. Then we would share our insights with each other. And then that conversation right there would lead to new creative syntheses, which we would then have to sort of go our separate ways and make sense of and then bring it back. And so it would be this iterative process. And each time we met, we would probably explore areas of ambiguity to each of us. And I think the result would be something very cool. Similar things have happened when like co-authors write a book together. Sometimes like one author takes charge and outlines it and then asks for specific input or specific contributions. But other times, if 2 authors come together and they're writing it together, then they have to make space for each other's voice. And so like, here's how I see an insight taking shape, and like, well, I actually see it a little bit differently. And through that process, there's going to be a creative synthesis that occurs that neither author could have generated on their own. So I think that's possible for a group heuristic inquiry, but everyone involved would have to be equally responsible for the creative syntheses and immersion in the subject area. Okay, so that's addressing what sort of happened in my research project. What we ended up doing was applying a more, let's say, systematic or structured analytic procedure following interpretative phenomenological analysis. I think that's Jonathan Smith and others, Larkin and Flowers, I think is the co-authors to the main methodology book for IPA. Because IPA looks at the themes that are present in interview transcripts, and that's something that we could all kind of do from our computers, just giving as much time as we were willing to give, and then kind of cross-checking what themes did you get, what themes did I get, and we were able to write a pretty good article that way. So we never followed through on the heuristic inquiry part. I did get my colleagues to reflect on what chronic absenteeism meant to them, and I may revisit that myself as a way of looking at not just from a student's perspective, why do they skip so many classes, but how does that impact college professors? And so perhaps that'll be on the horizon. Shifting now to the epistemology in heuristic inquiry, I want to go back to Clark Moustakas' book and then another book by Michael Polanyi. So this is the book by Moustakas, Heuristic Research, and I'll pull some quotes from that. Actually, I probably won't pull quotes during this video, but I have in a short article I wrote about this topic. And then Michael Polanyi, so this is the tacit dimension. This ends up being one of the biggest contributions, philosophical contributions to heuristic inquiry. And so that comes from the former chemist, Michael Polanyi. So Polanyi had a successful career as a chemist. And then in his later years, we're talking in his 70s, he started writing about philosophy of science and how his whole education had been focused on experimental science and the naturalistic approach and this ideal of experimenter detachment, the impersonal, detached researcher, and the privileging of objective observations. And these are all kind of heralded in the natural sciences or in the STEM disciplines. And in not the tacit dimension, but in his first big book on this topic, which is called Personal Knowledge, Polanyi criticizes or rejects the notion of objectivity, ultimately saying that there's no such thing as objectivity. That even though an experimenter may design their study to remove themselves as researcher as much as possible from the observations, to make observations that in principle anybody might make, so-called objective observations, Polanyi points out that even those are rooted in subjective awareness. I can't escape my subjectivity no matter how many controls I put into place. For example, in grad school, I was interested in studying the runner's high. And I noticed that a lot of biologists and physiologists and psychologists had studied the runner's high from the 80s onward. I think the first formal study was in 1980 by Michael Sachs. I ended up reviewing his data from his dissertation, his qualitative data from his dissertation, and analyzing it, publishing it in an article. But everybody who had studied the topic of runner's high was a runner. And it struck me that none of these people had been objective in their selection of a topic. Everybody had chosen a topic of near interest to them. Imagine somebody who absolutely hated running or had never run a step in their life, and they're like, you know what? I just woke up one morning and I was interested in studying the runner's high. Where would that interest come from? Well, of course, we're drawing on our personal value systems. And so just by selecting a topic, we've already kind of ruled out the detached scientist perspective. No matter how many controls we put in place, we're incapable of designing a purely objective study. And there's more details to Polanyi's critique, but that's just one of the big ones that I like quite a bit. Maurice Merleau-Ponty was a phenomenological philosopher who worked a lot in child psychology and psychopathology, who drew on, is that fair to say? Drew heavily on Polanyi's idea of personal knowledge. No, that would have to be the reverse. Polanyi wrote Personal Knowledge in 1958. Maurice Merleau-Ponty published his Structure of Behavior in the 40s, I believe. Double check that. Yeah, 1942 was his dissertation, and then Phenomenology of Perception, I believe, was 1945. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his book Structure of Behavior, criticizes the behaviorist approach to psychology, and of course the behaviorists were arguing for an experimental psychology, where there is no such thing as perspective or self or consciousness or dreams or anything that can't be empirically measured using the rules of experimental science or the naturalist perspective. And Merleau-Ponty went through behavior after behavior, sort of demonstrating how there's no such thing as a behavior, like a human or animal behavior, the way that there is a physical action or a physical object. So I understand why Polanyi would have drawn on that a lot in his book Personal Knowledge. And so the big contribution, in my opinion, of personal knowledge was that Polanyi points out that there's no such thing as a position of pure objectivity. So the ideal that is espoused by a natural scientist, that they are the detached scientist, is nothing more than an ideal. No one can actually live up to that. So if we're to criticize heuristic inquiry for being too personal, that's assuming that the detached scientist can occupy a position of neutrality, which they can't. So it's unfair to say either of them are too subjective, because subjectivity is the only access we have to the world. Now, Moustakas doesn't spend a lot of time on personal knowledge. He moves on to Polanyi's later work. So I've got that book, Tacit Dimension. And there's also another book, I think published the same year, called like Science and Society, or Science and Self and Society, Life Science, something like that, where he maybe explores a couple of the applications. It's been a while since I've read it, so I don't remember exactly. But in the Tacit Dimension, Polanyi describes types of personal knowledge or subjective knowledge, which again, in his opinion, is the only kind of knowledge we have access to. He calls this kind of personal knowledge tacit knowledge. And I don't know that he ever says it exactly, but tacit knowledge is compared to what we might call explicit knowledge. So I can pull up this coffee cup here and refer to an actual coffee cup, which is how I encounter it, and it's got coffee in it. I can see it, so I sort of look forward to drinking that in a little bit. But I have explicit knowledge about that because I can describe it in a way that's satisfying to me and to whoever I'm talking to. Tacit knowledge, by comparison, is the knowledge we have that we can't put into words. In other words, it's almost like our intuition, if I'm using it in the kind of vague adumbration kind of way. It's like I have a sense that something is the case, but I can't quite explain why. The example that Polanyi gives is in recognizing a person. If we see somebody we know, but they've changed something about their appearance, maybe they cut their hair, they've lost weight, or like they've changed their facial hair, or they're wearing glasses, or they've stopped wearing glasses, something is different, but we can't quite place it. So we'll see them and just know that something seems off. Maybe it's just their affect or their mood has changed dramatically. I'm thinking of examples of that now, but I don't need to go down all those trails. There's a recognition that we can't quite place. That is tacit knowledge. Because we can't articulate it, because we have a sense of the truth of what we're seeing, even though we're not sure what we're seeing, we can call that knowledge. But since we can't put it into words that are satisfying to ourselves and who we're talking to, it's a tacit kind of knowledge. It's not something that we can hold in our hands, yet it's still something that we have. And so in the tacit dimension, Polanyi describes two types of tacit knowledge. proximal tacit knowledge and distal tacit knowledge. Using the example of like seeing an old friend and there's something different about them, we might notice their hair, their glasses, their mood. These are the particulars. It's like we can focus on any one of these things, but it's the whole person that strikes us as different, but we're not quite sure why. And so we can focus on, is it new shoes? Like, have you lost weight? Like, you're picking on particulars. These individual foci, those are the proximal bits of tacit knowledge. That's what we have direct access to. But eventually, maybe they share it and then it clicks. Or maybe we realize, oh my goodness, like you're engaged. Or like we see like whatever it is like occurs to us and it all clicks into place. That's distal tacit knowledge. And so like both of these things are operating at a level we can't quite articulate. But we realize when we have the aha moment, the eureka moment, that it was at work all along. So we focus on the particulars, which we couldn't quite identify what the relationship was to the whole because we didn't know what the whole was. Once the whole becomes apparent, it clicks into place, and we have this aha moment. That is the distal tacit knowledge. Heuristic inquiry, the goal of heuristic inquiry is to have that eureka moment where the proximal bits of tacit knowledge, which we're staring at, that we're immersed in, we're surrounding ourselves with, we don't know what role they play in our subject matter, but we spend so much time and become so familiar with them that eventually, somewhere inside, somewhere in our body, in our awareness, we can't quite place it, but we have a realization. And the realization doesn't occur at the level of pen on paper or like the calculation that we're performing on a calculator or SPSS software. It happens in us. We live that solution. And it occurs to us, and all we can do is describe it. So that is the epistemological approach of heuristic inquiry. That's what the heuristic researcher is trying to do. They're trying to become so familiar with the particulars of an experience, chronic absenteeism. Moustakas did a lot of study of loneliness. He became lonely. He dwelled in loneliness. He talks to lonely people. He read poems written by lonely poets and stories written by lonely novelists. And he felt out the particulars. Okay, so this story was about that, and this story was about that, and this poem was about that. And there seems to be something linking them, and I'm calling that loneliness, but I'm not sure what that means. And after months and months, and I think actually like a full decade of exploring this and living it, a solution emerged in Moustakas. It wasn't out there, some detached scientist didn't notice it or discover it one day. It came into being the same way that Archimedes was like immersed in his bathtub, and he realized, I know how I can test whether or not the king's crown is actually made of gold, and went running naked down the streets as the story goes. But actually immersing yourself, in Archimedes' case, quite literally, but in Moustakas' case, figuratively, that's the process. That's the theory of knowledge behind heuristic inquiry. Now, what was I going to say? I had a neat little conclusion. Yes. Moustakas argues that this is objective. This is as objective as you can get. I don't know if I can find the actual quote. Ultimately, what he argues is heuristic inquiry works with real, unchanged human experience. And because you start there without transforming human experience into experimental constructs or laboratory constructs, that process right there kind of becomes artificial. Like if we studied loneliness in a laboratory, we'd be looking at something artificial. So by starting with loneliness in a person's life, that, for Moustakas, is objective. That is the most objective way of looking at it. Of course, if we look at it from a modern philosophy of science, it sounds like Moustakas is adopting a subjective perspective. But because Polanyi has shown that there's no such thing as objectivity, the closest we can get is to start with the raw experience without transforming it. That is as close as we can get to the real thing, or we could call that the objective thing. If you're writing a heuristic study, I would recommend not calling the method an objective science unless you had like a paragraph where you described what Moustakas means by that and differentiate it from what logical empiricism might call it or naturalism might call objectivity. I think you're likely to run into problems were you to follow Moustakas down that line. But it's neat that he calls it that, or he looks at it that way. And kind of shows that he was fully invested in Polanyi's critique of objectivity in modern science. Now I hear my dogs sprinting down the hallway, so I'm going to try to rush to wrap this up. I have a conference presentation that I gave on this topic in 2012, and I completely forgot about doing that. It was a pair of them, actually. One looking at the work of Merleau-Ponty, and then another looking at the work of Polanyi and Martin Buber, who both sort of support Moustakas' heuristic research. So I may do a couple more videos about this, of course. Now, maybe it'll be another 3 years before I do it. And I may, if I finish the Heuristic Inquiry project, I may end up writing a Doing Heuristic Inquiry manual, because I think it'd be really cool. There are a lot of neat insights that I think can be developed by a heuristic approach, not only to research, but to like life problem solving. And I'm really excited about the potential right now. So I'm not sure where it's going to go, but right now I'm ambitious and optimistic about it. Thank you all for your comments and encouragement and pressure to keep going.